Okay, everybody, welcome back. In today's lecture, we're just going to go over some of the basic processes that sustain life on Earth and the basic requirements for life on Earth. And I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about some vocabulary that is relevant to ecology. Let me just pull up my screenshot for you guys. And we will go from there. All right. So, there are many requirements to sustain life. We're not just talking about human life here, we're talking about life in general on our planet. And we generally refer to these requirements for life as the raw materials, the basic building blocks we need to survive. Most of the time, we can summarize these into just a few basic categories. We need water. You know, everybody knows that you need water, you need nutrients, you need oxygen. For humans, there's a basic rule of thumb, 3 minutes, 3 days, 3 weeks, right? You need to breathe, you need oxygen. You can't go without oxygen for more than 3 minutes. You can't go without water for more than 3 days. You can't go without food for more than 3 weeks. So for pretty much all living things, even though the time scale varies, these are the basic raw materials and requirements for life. We also refer to these in science as biomaterials because they're the things that living things need to survive. Like we talked about in the first lecture, all of these things have to be provided by the earth, which we only have one of. So therefore, they're all present in limited quantities and they must be recycled. A lot of people don't think about water as being recycled by living things. I mean, obviously we recycle water through for instance, water treatment plants and things like that. But water is recycled through living things. The water that you take in becomes part of your body. It's then released either as urine or sweat or other excretions from the body, or it returns to the environment when you die, and it's then used again. Even down at the atomic level, things are recycled in our environment, used over and over again. A carbon atom that's part of your body may previously have been part of a plant that you ate, and before that, maybe it was in the soil, and it was in the soil because some other living thing decomposed in the soil. So maybe it was in a deer. And then prior to that, maybe it was in a plant that the deer ate. But these atoms, even at that level, have to be recycled. And we refer to the recycling processes for these biomaterials as biogeochemical cycles. We're not going to talk too much about the biogeochemical cycles today, but we are going to get into them in the next video lecture. Another basic requirement for life is energy. We talked about the fact that a lot of the energy on our planet initially and originally comes from the sun. It's our one external input. Unlike the raw materials, energy is essentially limitless. We have about several billion years left in our sun before it burns itself out and we run out of energy. So we certainly, on any kind of human timescale, don't have to worry about that. We do have to worry about running out of the raw materials. Let's just talk a little bit about those raw materials. Life on our Earth is what we refer to as carbon-based, or at least most living things on Earth are carbon-based. What that means is that the basic building blocks of our life, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, which are the molecules that build all living things as we know them, have a carbon backbone. There is a chain of carbons that runs through these things and forms the backbone of their structure. That doesn't mean that carbon is the most common element in these items or these molecules. There's a lot of other atoms and elements present in all of these, but the carbon makes up the backbone. We're actually only about 12 to 19% carbon by weight. So if you could take all the atoms in your body and pile them up in little piles, only about 12 to 19% of your body weight would be carbon. You have a lot of other important molecules. Hydrogen is the most abundant if you could count them, but they only make up about 10% of your weight. So what that tells you is that they are a much smaller atom than carbon by size. So you can have a lot more of them and they still only make up about 10% of your weight. Oxygen is less abundant in the body, but it's much heavier than carbon. So it makes 63 to 77% of your weight would be made up of oxygen. Nitrogen is a much smaller component. It makes up most of your atmosphere. About over 70% of what you're sitting in and breathing in right now is nitrogen, but it only makes up about 1 to 4% of a living thing's structure. It is extremely important in living things, and we can't have protein without nitrogen. So you'll see that even though it makes up a fairly small percentage, it is very important. Excuse me. There's a few others: phosphorus, just under 1%, calcium, which overall is probably less abundant than phosphorus because it's so rare in plants, but in an animal, it makes up about 2% of our weight because of its prevalence in our bones. And then we have trace elements, which are things that are present less than 1% of our total weight, but still important in physiological or biogeochemical processes. Things like potassium, sodium, iron, zinc, and magnesium. So these are sort of the basic raw materials. There certainly are a few other things, a few other elements that are involved, but for the most part, these are the basic raw materials that have to be recycled over and over again. And here's just a little glimpse ahead at those biogeochemical cycles I said we'd talk about in the next class. Carbon gets recycled, oxygen gets recycled, water gets recycled, phosphorus, nitrogen, and so on, so that those individual elements are used over and over and over again in living things through this process of recycling. And that way, hopefully, we never run out. Energy, remember, is not something we're worried about running out of because we have a pretty limitless supply of it from the sun. You can see here an illustration of the electromagnetic spectrum, showing energy, basically the energy spectrum, from high wavelength energy on the left side of the screen to low wavelength energy on the right side. You can equate wavelength with how energetic something is, how much energy that has. If you imagine standing on the beach and looking out at the waves, if the waves are just rolling in real slow, you think of that as not having a lot of energy. But if they're pounding on the shore one after another, you can imagine that that seems much higher energy. And that's very much how the wavelength affects how much energy is present. Gamma rays, X-rays, and UV rays, which you can see over here on the left-hand side, are all very high energy and generally damaging to living systems. Obviously, we can use X-rays to look at what's going on inside the body, but you don't want to have too many of them. Ultraviolet, we associate with things like sunburn, skin cancer, etc., because of the damage that it does to living cells. Visible light, which you can see is a very, very small fraction of the spectrum, but we've blown it up in the picture here and expanded it out, is really the primary energy source for living systems. So just that very small wedge you see right there is really our main source of energy, because everything to the right-hand side of the screen, the infrared and the radio waves, are very low energy, and they don't provide enough energy to really be useful to living systems. Now, infrared we associate with heat, so obviously that is useful to us in the sense that it keeps us warm, but it doesn't drive the biogeochemical cycles the way visible light does. So this visible light, this tiny wedge of the electromagnetic spectrum that you see blown up here, not only provides, we say visible light, so obviously it provides the light for vision and allows us to see, but it also drives our climate, it drives the biogeochemical cycles, it generates the ocean currents, which subsequently contribute to climate, and it can be stored. It has historically in geologic time been stored as fossil fuel energy. Fossil fuels basically represent stored sunlight. Wood energy is just that same sunlight stored on a more recent time scale, because the plants use the light, the energy and visible light to grow and to create the wood, and then when we burn the wood, we release the energy. And as well as food, our food and all the energy that we get from food represents energy that was stored from visible light by plants, and then either we eat the plant directly or we eat the animal that ate the plant. That kind of brings me to the idea of conservation of energy. I've talked about converting, burning wood, or eating an animal and changing the form of energy. Conservation of energy is a principle of physics that tells us that the total energy in a system remains constant, but specifically referring to a closed system. And we know that we're not really a closed system because we rely on sunlight from the sun. But that total energy in the system remains constant because energy cannot be created or destroyed. It just changes form. And here we're going to look at a couple examples of that. Okay, here's an example for to start with, of the chemical energy that's contained within an ice cream cone can be utilized by our metabolism and our metabolic processes to give our energy, our muscles, the energy to do work. Jumping down to the illustration of the gas pump in the car, that's basically the same thing in a non-living system. So the chemical energy in gasoline is used by the combustion engine, which is basically the metabolism of the car, to generate the energy that turns the axle and spins the wheels and allows the car to move forward. We also have the radiant energy of sun being captured by photosynthesis, and that allows plants to grow in their structure, which creates food for us. Another example you might be familiar with is taking electrical energy and converting it through a process known as conversion to thermal energy, for example, in an electric stove. So we change from chemical to work or mechanical, we change from radiant to food, electrical to thermal, and so on. But we didn't actually just make energy. It came from somewhere, and it's never really destroyed. It comes from somewhere and it goes somewhere. Along the way, though, we almost always lose some of the energy as heat. So it's not a perfect conversion. You guys have all experienced this, right? If you've ever done work, your body warms up. You sweat to cool yourself off. Your car, when you drive it and you put your hand on the hood afterwards, you'll feel that there's heat, that it's warm. The bottom example is obviously the easiest example. You're actually trying to generate heat. So in this case, you're losing lots of it as heat. So the problem is that you can't convert the energy too many times, or you just, every step along the way, some is going to be lost. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Looking at the Earth and energy balance on a very, very large planetary scale, life on Earth depends on a constant input of energy from the sun. But if that energy if we didn't have a balance of that energy leaving the planet, it would build up and the planet would heat up. Okay, so we also must constantly lose energy to space. We radiate it in the form of heat out into space. If you were to block the input, excuse me, for instance, if something were to prevent the sunlight here from reaching the planet Earth, we would have certain consequences. The planet would become dark, obviously. It would also be cold because we would no longer have the heat. And food production would fall to zero because plants rely on the light of the sun to convert into the energy that they use to build themselves. This would result in starvation and eventual extinction of many species, and maybe us as well eventually, if it remained blocked for a long time. However, if we block the output, even though we see very different effects, we may end up seeing the same consequence. So if you look here, blocking the output would result in increased temperatures because now you're still putting heat in by solar radiation, but it's not able to re-radiate into space. So you're just increasing the energy of the planet. We would see changing weather patterns because more energy in the atmosphere creates stronger, more unpredictable weather patterns. We would start to see flooding because as the Earth warms, we would see an increased amount of loss of ice, as well as more water in the atmosphere. And we would therefore see reduced food production. So even though we saw no food production up here where we didn't have enough sunlight, now down here we'd have reduced food production because of changes in weather, changes in seasons, things like that, increased prevalence of damaging events. And so the eventual consequence could be the same. If we reduce food production, if we have damaging weather, we could still see starvation and extinction. So blocking either the input or the output has very negative consequences for life on Earth. I want to just kind of jump to a different topic here for a minute. I said I was going to talk a little bit about just some basic vocabulary related to ecology, and that's something that I want to do right now. Before I start using these terms, I want to make sure everybody's clear on what they mean. So when we look at this chart, what it basically does is it shows the levels of organizations of living things on the planet Earth. Scientists love to put things into categories because it helps make it easier to define what we're talking about and to define what we're studying. So you can see here at the bottom, we have several levels of organization that occur within an individual. Molecules combine to form cells, cells combine to form tissues and organ systems. All of those things combine together to form the organism, the individual living thing, in this case, a bison. We're not going to be talking about those levels of organization in this class. That's something you would study in a biology class or a human anatomy and physiology class if you meant humans. We're going to be looking at things at a little bit larger scale, things that involve multiple individuals. So these four terms are the terms that I want to make sure you're familiar with: population, community, ecosystem, and biosphere. A population is just a group of organisms that lives together in the same area, a group of organisms of one type, I should say. So in this example, it's a bison herd. If we were to talk about students on a college campus, for example, you could talk about the population of students. They all fall in the category of student. They all live in the same area on the college campus. A community involves multiple populations living together in the same area. So here they're showing a hawk, snake, bison, prairie dog, and grass, all living together in the same area, and we refer to that as the community. Referring back to our college example, if you were talking about the community of living things on a college campus, you'd be talking about not just the students, but the faculty, the staff, all the other people that work there, all the other living things, the squirrels, the birds, and the other living things that lived on that campus. An ecosystem now involves a community and its non-living surroundings. So now they've added to our list the stream, the rocks, the air. All of those things are non-living, but they're part of the ecosystem in this area. If we were talking about the ecosystem on a college campus, we would add in the parking lots, the buildings, the pathways, all of the things that the living things in that area interact with on a daily basis. And then the biosphere is really just all the ecosystems on Earth combined together. Ecology is the study of the distribution and abundance of living organisms and their connections to their physical environment. So it's really studying at the level of ecosystem, ecology, ecosystem. You're studying all the living things as well as how they interact with their non-living physical environment. Now, I said I was going to come back a little bit and talk about this idea of conversion of energy and how every time we transfer energy from one form to another, we lose some as heat. So we can't have too many transfers before we lose all the energy we started with. If we look at a basic description of how energy flows through an ecosystem, initially at the base, you have the sun, the energy from the sun, plus water from the environment, which is used to create energy in producers. Producers are the plants and the algae on our planet. This process is known as photosynthesis. So through the process of photosynthesis, they're able to take the energy from the sun and use it to grow and to create structure within themselves. They basically trap the energy. Then those plants are eaten by animals, which we refer to as consumers. So the energy moves from the energy of the sun to energy stored within the producers to energy stored within the consumers. There is another player in the game here in ecosystems, and those are the decomposers. Decomposers break everything down. So if you have any consumers or producers that die, they're going to be broken down by the decomposers, the bacteria and the fungi, to make their raw materials available once again in the environment. Most of you have probably heard the term food chain. You may or may not have heard the term food web. The reason that you've heard the term food chain is because that's typically how they teach about how energy flows through ecosystems to kids. So an example of a food chain. Let's look at this simple example here. Excuse me. You have a producer, which in this example is grass. It's taking energy from the sun, water from the environment, and also nutrients from the environment, and it's using them to grow. Then you have a primary consumer, the grasshopper in this case, which eats the grass, a secondary consumer, which is a snake, which eats the grasshopper, a tertiary consumer, the hawk, which eats the snake. And all of these, they're only showing the hawk being broken down by the fungus, but in reality, all three of these and dead grass would be broken down by the fungus to make nutrients available, to make the raw materials available for the producers once again. There's a reason that we teach it this way when we teach science to kids, and it's because it's very simple and easy to imagine. The problem is it's not very accurate. To teach a food web is much more accurate than to teach a food chain. It's just also much more confusing. So when you look at this picture, you see it's not so simple. You still have the producers down here at the bottom, the plants, but it's not just grasshoppers that are eating the plants. They're here. Those are the herbivorous insects, although that's not a grasshopper in that picture. That's where the grasshopper would fall. But you also have seed-eating birds, mice, squirrels, rabbits, and probably many more things that aren't shown on this graphic. Then they do show snakes on this list. They're up here, and they do show the snake eating the herbivorous insect. But there's a lot of other stuff that eats the herbivorous insects, and there's a lot of other stuff that snakes eat. That makes this much more complicated. There's also more than one tertiary consumer in the environment. So while they still show these same connections, you can see that it's much more complicated, and it becomes much more complicated to try to understand what might happen if one of these things was removed. If you look at the food chain and you imagine removing the grasshopper, it's very easy to imagine that snakes would starve, hawks would starve, and grass would grow out of control. Over here, if you remove the grasshopper, what's going to happen? Well, there's going to be more food for the rabbits, squirrels, mice, and seed-eating birds, so they might do a little bit better. There's going to be less food for the spiders, insectivorous birds, and predaceous insects, so they're going to start utilizing other resources more. So maybe the spiders won't have any herbivorous insects to eat, so they'll eat a lot more predaceous insects, so now those are going to get cut down. So now the toads are going to be very hungry, even though they weren't part of our original food chain at all. We might have more spiders because maybe they've switched to a more nutrient-rich food source, so the insectivorous birds might be happy. The snakes aren't really going to be affected at all because they've got plenty of food sources aside of toads and herbivorous insects. So you can see that it's much more complicated, much more difficult to understand. And humans really need to come to grips with the fact that we don't have a great understanding of the natural systems in our environment. And if we could come to grips with that, we might be less likely to make dramatic changes that end up affecting these systems in a negative way. Looking again at energy and living systems, remember I said that all of these living systems are not very efficient. A lot of the energy that they take in is lost as heat, basically as waste. Living systems operate at only about 10% efficiency. At each level in the food web, which we would call a trophic level, about 90% of the energy from the previous level is lost. So this is going to start to become a problem the more levels you have. If you look at this graphic with me for a minute, notice here we have a pyramid system where we're showing a million producers. So that could be like a million blades of grass, for example. The energy available at that level is about 10,000 units of energy. But if that 10,000 units of energy was consumed by these 10,000 primary consumers, they eat the blades of grass, 9,000 units of energy is going to be lost as heat. That's 90%. So now our next level, our primary consumers, only have 1,000 units of energy available. They started with 10,000 at the producer level. They lost 9,000 as heat. So there's 1,000 left. So you have 10,000 primary consumers that contain within themselves 1,000 units of energy. When those 10,000 consumers are consumed by secondary consumers, 90% is again lost as heat. So you lose 900 units as heat, and now you have only 100 units of energy left available. Because of this, you can only support one tertiary consumer on 1,000,000 blades of grass. That one tertiary consumer, when they consume the 100 units of energy from the secondary consumers, 90% is lost as heat, and we end up with only 10 units of energy in our one tertiary consumer. If we went one more level, there would not be enough energy. So this limits how many steps there can be in a food chain, depending on the number of animals at the bottom, or organisms, I should say, at the bottom of the pyramid. Because of this, you're going to see later when we start talking about food, this is why many environmentalists talk about how eating, quote, lower to the bottom of the food chain would save us energy and would provide us with more food to feed people. Because in many people's diet, they're eating up here in the tertiary or secondary consumer level, because they're eating primary consumers, cows, pigs, things like that, and they're losing energy at every step along the way. We'll get into that a little bit more when we start to get into how much land it takes to support a human. That's all the basic information I have for you guys in Ecology 1. We're going to move on and talk about the biogeochemical cycles and some other information related to principles of ecology when we get into part 2 of this module. I did want to mention to you that your assignment related to this module is to watch the video, The Story of Stuff, which is a 20-minute video produced in 2007 that looks at sort of the, quote, darker side of our production and consumption patterns. Even though it was produced in 2007, the facts in the video still pretty much hold true. There may be a few statistics that have gotten worse, but certainly nothing has gotten very much better. So you should be able to get something from that. After you watch the Story of Stuff video, which shouldn't take you too long, it's posted in a separate link in this module folder. You're going to complete the discussion board assignment, also posted in this module folder. There's a full description of what I want you to discuss, basically talking about some of the things that were new to you or surprising, and also touching on certain principles that were presented in the video and talking about whether or not you think people are really aware of these. You're going to post your initial response and then comment on at least 2 of your peers' posts and respond to the comments you receive by Sunday, September 6th at midnight, so I can look those over before next week. The rest of the information, the next video lecture for this module, is going to be covered next week in class, so it will show up on your Blackboard in this Module 1 folder, probably on around Sunday afternoon or evening of next week. So that would be Sunday, September 6th. That will become available to you. At the absolute latest, it would show up Monday morning, so you can look for it then. Thank you, guys. And I'm going to wrap this up now and shut down our video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great week.